In their often polemical, public writings, a number of the founding generation at times chose Greek or Latinate pseudonyms derived from their knowledge of ancient history. Often the pseudonym in question was intended not just to conceal the author's identity, but more importantly to convey a political message. It was a shorthand form of argument by historical analogy. Hamilton, for instance, selected such names as Phocion and Tully when he wished to draw parallels between past and present circumstances. More famously, in 1787, two of the most outspoken opponents of ratification of the Constitution unleashed fusillades in the press under the portentous names Brutus and Cato. Their obvious point was that the proposed new Constitution contained the seeds of Caesarian despotism. It was a point that their classically educated readers would have instantly understood. In response, to these dangerous attacks by the Anti-Federalists, three leading proponents of the Constitution penned the immortal tract called the Federalist or Federalist Papers. You and I know the names of the authors: James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. But that is not how they presented themselves in 1787. Instead, they adopted a single pen name, Publius, after Publius Valerius Publicola, who in the 6th century BC helped to expel the last king of Rome and establish the Roman Republic. Among his fellow citizens, Publius Valerius was acclaimed for his nobleness of character and devotion to republican principles. The authors of the Federalist Papers knew that their audience would grasp the reassuring resonance of their literary allusion. Why? Because of their common culture, formed in part by their reading of Plutarch's Lives and other ancient texts. The founders' self-conscious use of politically apt historical pseudonyms opens a small but revealing window, I think, into their mental world, a landscape adorned with shelves of well-thumbed books. Surely the most spectacular instance, however, of the Founding Fathers' use of books was provided by that other scholarly gentleman from Virginia, James Madison. In 1784, as the Articles of Confederation increasingly manifested their fatal flaws, the youthful protege of Thomas Jefferson launched a comprehensive study of all previous confederations in history. What were their characteristic strengths and defects, he wondered? Why did they fail? How could Americans avoid a similar fate? To facilitate his project, Madison required books, and for these he turned appropriately to Jefferson. In a letter in March 1784, Madison asked his friend to purchase for him whatever may throw light on the general constitution and droit public, or public law, of the several confederacies which have existed. In a few months, Jefferson was in Paris, and from France he sent back books by the score, something like 200 books. Eventually, in the spring of 1787, after 3 years of determined investigation, Madison distilled his research into 2 memoranda and devised the so-called Virginia Plan that framed the debate at the Constitutional Convention. Madison did not obtain all he wanted in Philadelphia. Nevertheless, without this self-imposed historical inquiry that he undertook in 1784 and the uses to which he then put it, the very structure of our republic might have been different. In surveying the role of books in the lives of the Founding Fathers, we must not overlook another dimension, that many of them were themselves creators of books, including several that have deservedly become classics. One thinks of Franklin's autobiography, Jefferson's Notes in the State of Virginia, and Adams's Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. One thinks of John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, and the late 18th century explosion of political pamphleteering, to which I alluded earlier. And at the pinnacle, the Federalist, America's greatest contribution to political theory. A work produced by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay in just a matter of months. Is there anyone alive today who could accomplish a similar feat of intellect in the same limited amount of time and expect the product to be read 200 years later? Sometimes, indeed, it seems that the men of 1776 and 1787 never stopped writing. Their literary output of all kinds was prodigious. Consider for a moment the monumental scholarly enterprises that are now publishing in definitive form the papers of the principal founders. The papers of Alexander Hamilton, 27 volumes, and now complete. The papers of James Madison, 29 volumes so far and 23 more in the pipeline. The papers of Benjamin Franklin, 37 to date, 37 volumes, and the editors have only reached the year 1782. The papers of George Washington, 54 volumes, including 6 volumes of diaries, when I last checked the bookshelf. The papers of John Adams, well, so many volumes now that I've lost count. Somewhere I have read that Thomas Jefferson composed 25,000 letters in his lifetime. Whatever the figure, I do know this. When the magisterial Jefferson Papers publication project, initiated more than half a century ago, is completed sometime in this century, we hope, it will comprise 75 hefty volumes. The Founding Fathers, then, were readers, collectors, users, and creators of books. A few of them went further and became founders of institutional libraries, thereby perpetuating their influence beyond the grave. The earliest to do this was Franklin. In 1731, the 25-year-old Pennsylvania printer and his friends in a club known as the Junto established the Library Company of Philadelphia, which I believe still exists. It was the first subscription library in North America. The motive behind their initiative, as well as behind the Junto itself, was partly utilitarian, a yearning on the part of Franklin and his cohorts for what they called mutual improvement. What is less well known, perhaps, is that the idea of forming the Junto in the first place came from a book, the very essays by Cotton Mather that Franklin credited with changing his life. In later years, Franklin was a faithful patron of libraries. On trips to Europe, he selected books for his library company and had the satisfaction of seeing it serve as a reference library for the Constitutional Convention. He helped to develop the library of the American Philosophical Association, and he was not alone in this kind of benefaction. His fellow Pennsylvanian John Dickinson donated more than 1,500 volumes to Dickinson College after it was chartered in 1783. In 1822, 4 years before his death, John Adams presented the remainder of his book collection, except for a few that he wished to retain for what he called consolation in his final days, to the town of Quincy, Massachusetts, near Boston. Adams intended his books to be placed in a prospective Greek and Latin academy, which was not established, as it turned out, until long after his death. Eventually, his gift found its way to the Boston Public Library, where it survives today. Undoubtedly, the most sublime example of this beneficent impulse comes, fittingly enough, from those two Virginia soulmates, Madison and Jefferson. In 1783, Madison attempted to persuade the Continental Congress to establish a library for its own use. With customary meticulousness, and probably with Jefferson's behind-the-scenes assistance, he even compiled a list of 300 prospective titles. Madison's motion failed when Congress, still recovering from the costly War for Independence, refused to appropriate money for such a purpose. Not until 1800, in the administration of President John Adams, did the government at last create the Library of Congress.